Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Fritz the Cat from 1972. And this is the winner of my Patreon movie review vote. If you would like for me to review a movie of your choice, then click on the link below for my Patreon and pledge and pick a movie, and then maybe I'll be reviewing your movie next month. Fritz the Cat is sort of an interesting film to talk about in that the name is very well known. Everyone knows Ralph Bakshi's involved. It was based on an R. Crumb comic. It's an X-rated cartoon, and those are a lot of things. Enough things that most people forget that it is an actual movie, and no one much quotes it or actually talks about anything that is within the film Fritz the Cat. It's kind of more on the reputation of everything involved being like an adult cartoon, an X-rated cartoon, being the film that launched Ralph Bakshi, being the film that R. Crumb hated. Those are the things that are most associated with this film. And I think those are worthy things to talk about, and there's certainly things that I'm gonna talk about, but I think also I want to talk about the movie. And it's sort of interesting that this film was a major turning point in animation. It was a major change and brought about more adult-oriented animated films actually making money and actually having people see them. I often heard before this film was coming out, they said if this could do what Yellow Submarine did. Although I think Yellow Submarine is maybe a better movie, and certainly you could smoke weed while watching Yellow Submarine, that's fine, but it is sort of a kid's film. Fritz the Cat is not a kid's film. Don't show this to your kids. That's not good. Fritz the Cat is an X-rated animated film. It's very much themed for adults. And in 1972, you weren't really getting that at all. There was no anything really in terms of adult-oriented animation. If there were, they were doing it overseas and was playing for a few weirdos in America who I would probably be friends with now or something. But at the time, this was a big mainstream kind of X-rated animated thing, and it showed that animation could be for adults. That's kind of a double-edged sword in that I think a lot of people took that for a while. If any animation was aimed at adults, it was like kind of this weird, trippy, druggy sex thing or whatever. But I think that's more of other people's preconceived notions than it's really Fritz the Cat's fault. Maybe it's the fault of the success of Fritz the Cat, but it's not actually Fritz the Cat's fault. Fritz the Cat did not say everything should be like that. But I think what's sort of interesting about this film is this is Ralph Bakshi's first film. It would launch his career. It's interesting this is Ralph Bakshi's first film because this film doesn't really represent the rest of his filmography. It's kind of like the odd man out, basically. And it was certainly maybe his biggest hit outside of Lord of the Rings, which may have been bigger. But it was a huge, ginormous hit, and it let him make things like Heavy Traffic and American Pop. And it paved the way for all of those films, but it doesn't really feel like a Ralph Bakshi movie in terms of all the others. It's kind of its own thing. Now, this is his first kind of feature. It's him coming out of working at Terry Toons and doing Heckle and Jekyll stuff and working on the 60s Spider-Man show. But what makes Fritz the Cat sort of different, but also very kind of digestible and audience friendly and so forth, it actually makes sort of sense it was a big hit and such a big movie, is because it's just like watching Fritz go from one thing to another. It very much plays like a party film. I think this movie sort of runs out of steam after a while, where the sequence in Harlem is really great. The early sequence in the film where they're in just a Washington Square Park, NYU sort of area, I guess. But the later sequence where they leave New York, I think this film almost plays like sort of like After Hours, or more recently Good Time or something, a night or a few nights in New York City and going on adventures within it. For those parts, it kind of played like maybe a great animated version of one of those kind of one night in New York City kind of things. And I actually was surprised because I had seen Fritz the Cat when I was more of a teenager and I wanted to see it just because it was X-rated and stuff. When I was rewatching it, this is the second time I've seen it, I was kind of taken aback by how much those things worked, and remind me, I haven't really done any of the stuff Fritz did in this movie, but it reminded me of the fun of a New York City summer or walking around New York City and getting into adventures. It's just when he leaves New York, this film really completely falls apart, and it doesn't really hold up as well. But those sequences, particularly when they're stealing the car and when he's doing the revolution stuff, and this is very much of its time, it's kind of playing into the whole sexual revolution thing, but more of that all women just sort of want to have sex all the time because they're free now. Fritz is totally appealable to any woman who wants to have sex with him. It's kind of like if Porky's wanted to talk about revolution and was animated, is sort of what Fritz the Cat is. It sort of is a cynical view of the politics of the time, but it's still sort of being satirical while also doing it. I don't know how real satirical it's being. It's definitely doing it in a very tongue-in-cheek way, but I think it really works in that, and you can sort of laugh at it. It does kind of play so into the inappropriateness of this film, like the X-rated or, the more adult-oriented themes, in a way that would probably be obnoxious if someone did as much now, because there's no real point of them doing it. They're just kind of like, hey, look at, we're doing this, but you kind of have to put this film in the context of its time, obviously. I still think a lot of that is fun to a certain regard. It is like a bit much sometimes, but I generally sort of enjoy it. I think it's not as obnoxious as something that are just kind of trying to appeal to 13-year-olds who just learned how to say fuck and something like that. Fritz the Cat isn't like that, really. It's just trying to show an audience who was completely devoid of any, adult-oriented animation and sort of do something different. This is kind of appealing more to an audience that's never seen adult-oriented animation, so of course they're going to have as much fun with that as they possibly can. And it's really diversified animation, especially more so in America and I guess in English-speaking countries, which I think was a good thing, but a lot of animators didn't. And when Ralph Bakshi came to Los Angeles, because he's a New York animator, a lot of animators who worked at Warner Brothers and in fact the co-creator of Donald Duck came to work on this film just because they believed in the idea of diversifying animation. Animation had just been in this one box, and they were like, we don't want to just appeal to kids, let's have different styles. That's why Yellow Submarine was such a big deal, but it was taking on the pop style and bringing it to animation, and frankly Disney was not interested in doing things like that, as there were no other big animation studios at the time. It was fairly insanely limiting, and actually a bunch of other animators though objected to animation being put in kind of these inappropriate X-rated terms, and actually put out a ad in Variety saying, Ralph Bakshi, get your filth out of here, we don't want your filth, or something like that. He sort of ignored it and kept going, thankfully. But that shows kind of like there were people who accepted like, hey, animation can do this, and there are other people who said frankly it shouldn't, like we should not be doing this, animation is this one thing. And Ralph Bakshi has various different quotes about this, like it just felt a little weird making, drawing pretty flowers, at your desk when Vietnam is going on. I don't know if Fritz the Cat is like maybe the best result from that quote, but I get his point that animation needs to be able to tell different voices, and this was a big stepping stone in the history of animation. This was a film that really showed people, hey, you could make money at doing this. And Ralph Bakshi's whole career in lots of animated films that got released, not all of them were necessarily successful, but going from this all the way to something like Heavy Metal, Ralph Bakshi kind of lit that path by making this film with producer Steve Krantz, and I think it's kind of awesome that they did it. I don't know if this film is necessarily that good. It's kind of interesting to see this film not brought up as much in terms of like references or anything like that, despite it being such a huge film, frankly, in film history. And I don't necessarily think it is. It's kind of like one of those films where its reputation, what its influence might be a lot greater than the film itself. I know R. Crumb doesn't like this film, although Bakshi said he still like collected a lot of money on this and did get a percentage and did get paid for the rights. He just like seems to not really like it and is called kind of like a huckster, I believe. R. Crumb like killed Fritz the Cat in his comics shortly after because he hated what it had become, and it was one of his more successful creations, and it's still probably one of the things that people most remember R. Crumb for, which I guess sort of sucks for him. I think that's a shame. I know R. Crumb's views on animation are a little limited and kind of more to do with like what was around when he was a kid. I do think it is different from what he's doing. It's more of a Ralph Bakshi's Fritz the Cat than R. Crumb's Fritz the Cat, which might have been the issue. I still would hope that R. Crumb would get the major stepping stone it was for animation, but I don't think he probably ever will, and that's fine. As an adaptation, I don't think it feels very R. Crumb, and I think that probably sucks to have something personal to you as a illustrator be, turned into something different as an animated film. And this was kind of a grassroots thing. X-rated films now, and especially in 1972, couldn't get ads in major newspapers. You couldn't talk about it on TV. They wouldn't write reviews. So it was really kind of an underground thing, and it was limited and would go from town to town, but it eventually made like $90 to $100 million worldwide by doing that, because everyone wanted to see the X-rated animated film. And it did launch other ones that were less successful after that, but it kind of showed that people were ready for something like this, and people were into different stuff at the time. Every time I research this, everyone's saying because of the success of Yellow Submarine, which is sort of interesting how this ended up being tied into that in a lot of ways. I think it's nice that Fritz the Cat and animation got to play some part in 70s filmmaking, and it's interesting, Ralph Bakshi really launched kind of an auteur career in animation at a time when there wasn't really anyone doing that with Fritz the Cat. Now, I don't think any of his films like Heavy Traffic and Coonskin and American Pop and Hey Good Looking never really were as successful as Fritz the Cat, and Fritz the Cat was kind of just this explosion in animation, but I think it is kind of one of the great footnotes in animation history. It's kind of one of those things where you just go, hey, Fritz the Cat happened, and there was a time in the 70s where people, like to get high, so they'd like put up with these adult animated films, and then the 80s happened, and they were like, I don't know, I'm not probably going to do that anymore. Which is upsetting and kind of limiting, and it felt like the 70s, this started a wave in the 70s where there were kind of different kind of animated films, and I think that's like really, really cool. I really love that about this period and love what Ralph Bakshi did. I don't necessarily think this as itself, I think it's more like interesting as its legacy, but this film itself is kind of like a nice watch. I see it maybe every like 20 years or something, but it's never like, when I was watching it felt like I was watching it again for the first time, and I've seen this before because it left like so little of an impression. Probably going to remember it more now because I was, really more studying it, I guess. Well, I mean, I watched it, but I was just reading into it and kind of being interested. Like, I didn't know that ad about Variety. I didn't know that older animators really actually came to his aid and everything like that. It was kind of like gave me more of a backstory to it. I also like how experimental it could be. I like the Billie Holiday song. I like where the one like crow's like snapping his fingers while the background like slowly comes in. I thought that was really cool. It does have a real experimental kind of crazy vibe to it. They didn't do pencil tests or model sheets or anything. It felt like they made this really on the fly, and that's really the feel this film has. It's cool that 70s Hollywood filmmaking was this big explosion of creativity and like all these new voices and like a changing of the guard, and that Ralph Bakshi in animation got to play like a major part in that, I think is really, really cool. Fritz the Cat is an important piece of animation history, and it's something that if you like animation, you should definitely, check out at least once. But it's kind of more like, once you've heard of it and heard of what it does, that's probably the most important part of it. I will say it's probably the Ralph Bakshi film I enjoyed more. It's one I really enjoyed. I probably enjoyed it more than something like, Cool World, and like I had a fun time with it, but it kind of just feels like a fun, enjoyable, disposable sort of time. But I think, since animation hadn't been that for anyone, for a lot of the baby boomers who were getting, stoned out and seeing it, I can understand why it was such a hit. I kind of maybe was able to contextualize it a little more and understand it in ways that I hadn't before, and I think I'm glad I got to re-see it. And I think Fritz the Cat is something that like you'll have a good time with it. I don't know if it's as essential as it is an essential part of animation history, but it's still a fun time, and it's fun seeing Fritz get up to his various adventures and all the various trouble he does in this movie. So if you have seen Fritz the Cat and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And again, this was the winner of my Patreon movie review vote. If you would like for me to review a movie of your choice, then click on the link below for my Patreon and pledge, and maybe I'll be reviewing your movie next month. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.